Book, a lie, in a world that changed forever. Imagine living in a world where a single book could turn your neighbor, your friend, and even your own family against you. Hey, welcome. I'm Gary Watson, and you've landed on the Geezerville Chronicles YouTube website. Congratulations. I'm glad you found me here. You know, if you enjoy storytelling and conversations about history and where we are in today's world, then, consider sharing this episode with a friend or a colleague. It helps me more than you know. And I just want to remind you, there's a new feature this year that I just started. I'm writing a companion essay to each Echoes of Deception episode, and that essay appears on my Substack website, and all the links are below, so you don't have to worry about remembering that. Just check in the video description below and you'll find everything you need there. Now, having said all that, let's get started. This is episode 12. What if democracy doesn't collapse due to violence? What if it erodes because the stories we choose to believe are never questioned? I grew up believing in Camelot, and later I lived through Morning in America. Two presidents, two powerful narratives, both inspiring, but both incomplete. And here's a question I keep coming back to. If we inherit myths rather than memories, can democracy survive? Let me tell you why I'm asking. I remember sitting in our family living room with our black and white TV. I think it was an RCA, and we were all focused on the television, and it was the Kennedy-Nixon debate. And you see, my parents were strong Democrats. And so when the debate was over, they shouted, Kennedy won. And their excitement became mine. And it looked like, for the first time, a Catholic might actually be in line to occupy the White House. That would be a first. You see, in that debate, Kennedy looked young, confident, composed, and Nixon looked tired and kind of weathered, and he looked pale. Of course, it was a black and white screen, but he did look pale. I recall that. And at that age, what I saw mattered more than what I heard. And it was years later that I discovered that there were people still listening on the radio. And those people who listened on the radio actually thought that Kennedy lost that first debate and Nixon won. And after all, the election was finally won by a razor-thin margin. You see, imaging and perception made a difference. And from that day forward, Camelot became a story. And I believed in it. And I believed in Ask Not. And I believed in the Peace Corps. And I believed in an America where there was no ceiling for anyone. That was my Camelot. Now, here's the part about JFK that took me really decades to absorb. You see, Kennedy escalated the Vietnam crisis. It was on his watch. And that's a fact that history can't really erase. And that war proved to be one of the most disastrous wars in American history. Kennedy also, contrary to his image, was slow to pick up the civil rights initiative. And he was by far not the leader of the pack when it came to civil rights. And he used also the missile gap argument in dealing with the Soviet Union as a means of escalating our military capability. Now, none of those things really erase his gifts as a leader and president, but it certainly rounds out his portrait. Now, I remember in high school practicing the duck and cover drills, where the siren would go off and you'd jump under your desk. Now, as kids, I don't think many of us really understood anything about what an atomic blast would do. But nonetheless, the ritual probably did make us feel more comfortable during those times. And if you didn't live in those specific moments around 1962 with the missile crisis in Cuba, you don't really appreciate this part of my story. It was truly frightening, and some kids had nightmares about it, and about an atomic blast going off in their neighborhood. In fact, I doubt many of you really remember a day in October 27th, 1962. I remember the date because it's my birth date. And what happened off the shores of Cuba, a Russian submarine, from the Soviet Union, I should say, in that time, was about to launch a nuclear torpedo, and only one man on that crew stopped it, which, when you think about it, it frightens you to the core. One man who could turn the course of history, and we don't know his name. But one thing for sure, we know that Camelot didn't include that image. And here's something else, a quote that was made, I believe, to Kennedy's speechwriter, where Kennedy told the speechwriter that foreign policy mattered more than a debate over the minimum wage. That was something that struck me, of course, many years later, because you see, at the time, the minimum wage mattered in my house. I remember having to work at 15 with a job permit, and I earned enough money to help my mom and dad buy me school clothes. So that part of Kennedy that often didn't come out is something that stuck and tarnished, I guess was the right word, tarnished my image of Camelot and who Kennedy was. But you see, here's the thing that I don't want to lose about Kennedy. He inspired me to be a better person, to contribute. He inspired me to dream about what it is that I wanted to become. And I guess that leaves me with the real question of, it's not whether inspiration matters, it's whether inspiration is good enough to make me want to be a good citizen. Now let's do a little time travel. Let's go forward from the 60s to the 80s and Ronald Reagan and Morning in America and the shining city on a hill. Now, Reagan didn't just argue policy. He offered identity. He invited Americans to feel capable again. I remember moving to Mississippi in 1980, and My daughter was born there. I was working in a large manufacturing facility that did something very unusual. We built a compensation system that was based on skill, not rank, not seniority, and not skin color. If you learned more, you were paid more. And the classes were open for everyone, and we conducted them and absorbed that cost. Our competitors thought we were absolutely crazy. And they said we would go broke, but you know what? We didn't. One afternoon, during a major startup, a black woman on my team had to thread. Her task was to thread a 30-foot wide sheet of paper, moving at over 2,000 feet a minute, into a stack of steel rollers. She failed twice, and the tears were running down her face. But she didn't back away. She'd been trained, and she stood her ground. And on the third attempt, the paper fed through and went onto the reel. And the crowd that was witnessing the startup cheered. And she looked down at me, and I gave her a thumbs up. And the smile she gave at that point stuck with me to this very day. In that moment, Reagan's message about American capacity rang true. People, given the opportunity, can do extraordinary things. And remember, this was Mississippi in the 1980s. But here's the part we need to remember. Reagan's time in office brought rising deficits that would only escalate going forward and further divide America according to wealth. They called it Reaganomics. The rich benefited enormously over the next decade. But lest we forget, David Stockman, the architect of his economic policy, called it a complete failure later in life. There were no wars during his administration, but he expanded covert operations around the globe. And he did so illegally and off the books. It became a new form of military coercion around the world in the name of democracy. And here's the thing, he famously negotiated with Gorbachev, and he shocked the world with Take Down the Wall. But behind the scenes, he pressured his administration to expand enormously the military spending budget. You see, Reagan the president inspired many, but Reagan the man was complicated, just like Kennedy. Nonetheless, his legacy evolved quickly into a mythology, and most citizens lived inside the mythology and not the reality or its aftermath decades later. Here's what feels different today. In the Reagan and Kennedy years, ideology framed argument, but there were shared assumptions. Democracy was viewed as legitimate. Institutions mattered. Truth could be pursued. And the other party, often viewed as wrong, was never viewed as illegitimate. Today, identity often precedes ideology. Belonging sometimes replaces persuasion, and institutions are not just criticized, they're dismissed, they're ghosted, as the phrase would have it. Media doesn't filter, it amplifies in today's environment. And now AI can manufacture narratives at scale. So the real question becomes, can democracy survive when shared reality becomes optional. You know, I'm not naive about our past. We have wrestled with empire, with injustice, with caste and racial economics. We often say, this is not who we are. Maybe the more honest beginning is, this is who we have been. And we're still trying to decide who we want to become. I think about my parents cheering in that living room. I think about my uncle flying B-52 missions over Southeast Asia, believing he was defending freedom because that was the story he had been given. Stories shape obedience as much as aspiration. But here's what I still believe. I believe that most people carry inside them a kernel that longs for dignity and fairness. You know, I've often said that hope is not something we wish for. Hope is something we make. Democracy survives when citizens are willing to revisit the stories that they inherited. Not to tear them down, but to understand them more fully. Maybe that's the work that echoes from past generations to future generations. You know, since the first symbols were written 5,000 years ago, one thing seems certain. Their echoes will always be there. And the question is whether we're listening carefully enough to understand them. That's all for now, and I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, I sincerely hope that you'll feel that you would want to subscribe, because that helps me a lot. And furthermore, if you want to share this video, I would really appreciate it. It helps me build an audience and a community. And that's what this effort is all about. And I want to remind you, Substack essays on this particular episode exist. They're out there now. And all you have to do is go to my Substack, because you know what? It's hard to compress a lot of the research that was done to produce this episode in just 15 minutes. With that said, thanks so much and have a wonderful day.